So maybe you've read the declassified remote viewing documents from SRI in the early 1970s. You've listened to all the interviews with Hal Puthoff, Russell Targ, Skip Atwater, and many of the other early remote viewers. You've read the masses of books and publications covering this era of research. You've seen Third Eye Spies, and maybe you've watched my previous 3 episodes covering the Pat Price papers. Whether you've consumed everything I just mentioned or only some of it, then you probably feel like you know all there is to publicly know about Pat Price, his work, and his mysterious death. I wouldn't blame you if you looked at the thumbnail for this video and thought to yourself, great, another YouTuber rehashing Pat Price, more of the same. Well, even if you have read, watched, and listened to all of the above, I feel pretty confident that unless you knew Pat personally or know someone that did, then today you're going to learn something new, if not a good few things. I don't think there is a link left on Google, Brave, Yandex, and the Internet Archive that has Pat's name in it that I haven't trawled through. So get ready for a boatload of contradiction, deception, confusion, and a whole new set of questions about who the hell really was Mr. Patrick H. Price.
Able to explain them as hoaxes, erroneously identified friendly aircraft, meteorological or electronic phenomena, or as light aberration.
Fear of ridicule was the foundation on which the cover-up was placed. But I suspect in something which is as unacceptable as a reality as this phenomenon, no piece of physical evidence would satisfy anybody.
Do not worry, I am not clickbaiting you. I mean it when I say that what I have for you today is likely stuff that you've previously not heard before. I do need to touch on some of the more well-known sources that reference Pat, for the purpose of having to weave all of this together and demonstrate how much stories change from one account to the other, because nothing about Pat Price is as clear-cut as you might think. Now, don't hate me. I know what I said, and I meant it when I said it. But this is not the final episode in the series. Trust me, I wanted it to be the last one so I could move on to pastures new, but as you can see, this is already a long episode. Before I'd even started touching on Pat's death and collating and formatting all my research that I've done into that, it became more and more apparent to me as to why I needed a breather from all of this over the Christmas period in the first place. Because it's a lot. It's a lot to take in, it's a lot to process, and bombarding you with everything all at once just felt like I'd be leaving you in the same condition I've been in for the last month, where I've not even wanted to touch any of this to try and make it all make sense, because it's just too much. So hopefully by the end of this episode you understand why I have chosen to split this last portion of research. I'm not milking this, I have no reason to, I'm not making any money here, so please stick around till the end, because there's not really 5 minutes of this episode where at any given section you could make a conclusion that might not end up having something else come up later down the line that throws all of that back into question all over again. So I just want to give you a quick overview of what's in store on this episode. We have MKUltra links, omissions about Pat's history, questions about his entrance into the SRI program in the first place, a mystery figure in Pat's life that once I found out about melted my brain and made me question everything for about the 6th time during this research. We're also going to take a look at that famous remote viewing he did of the Russian facility Semipalatinsk. And for my American viewers, which is the vast majority of you based on what my analytics tell me, I have a thread, a tentative one, but a thread worth pulling on nonetheless, that maybe one of you might be inclined to pick up the baton on, because I've hit a wall with what I can access and find insight on from over here in the UK, and I am very curious to see if there's a there. We've got a lot of ground to cover essentially, so that's enough prologue from me. Let's get this show on the road. Okay, so where I want to start this is with the first book ever published with Pat's name in it, and that's The Search for Superman by John L. Wilhelm, published in 1976. Now, this is a little known about gem, and sadly it's been out of print for a long time, meaning it's now very hard to come by and expensive when you do so. But blessed be the Internet Archive and the generous soul that uploaded a copy, which meant that I didn't have to starve for a few weeks in order to save up for my own. I've popped the link to it in my description, so if you want to read the whole thing for yourself, you can do so. Now, what makes this a standout when it comes to the insight to be gleaned about Pat Price, that unlike every book that has his name printed in it thereafter, it was written when Pat was still alive. John was not Pat's friend or colleague, so this isn't like when Russell Togg or Hal Puthoff recollect things from memory about Pat or relay them with a slight angle to them or to spin in their own interest or conflict they may have. John was there to research and write about what SRI was doing in parapsychology research, get to know and suss out those involved, and of those conversations he recorded and later wrote them in his book, word for word. Alright, so let's dive into the search for Superman and see what John Wilhelm was told about Pat Price in 1974. Pat Price was standing quietly behind Puthoff throughout the entire 2 or 3 minutes of the trip. Now, would you like to see what I got? He asked, leading us next door to Puthoff's office. There on the chalkboard in large script, Price had written 8 of clubs. His ruddy face beamed with pleasure as he coyly refused to reveal whether telepathy, clairvoyance, or just plain conjuring had given him the answer. More puzzled than surprised, Puthoff laughed. I know how I got the answer, but I don't know how Pat got it. Patrick H. Price Sr. had been under SRI scrutiny off and on for several months, working under deep cover and near anonymity, the way he prefers it. He is reluctant to discuss his experiments. Unlike Geller, whose penchant for publicity is enormous, and Swan, who does not mind recognition as long as it is favourable and styled according to his own conception of himself. Price simply wants to come to the lab, do his physics feats, go home, and fish on the weekends. There is some of the Range Rider's grit to his nature, independent, tough, acknowledging the world on his own terms, or terms impressed on him by a system that he has now made his own. Short, muscular, with calloused hands and a lean belly, Price, at 55 years of age, betrays traits of a life more physical than mental. His crystalline blue eyes are overhung with mossy brows, eyes deliberately trained to stare without blinking. Born December 8, 1918, the 9th of 10 children in a close-knit Salt Lake City Mormon family. He guards the privacy of his early years like a mother wolf cuddling her litter. Just bits and pieces scramble out before being safely tucked away again. When the scientists at SRI talk about Pat Price, they invariably bolster his credibility by dropping that he is a former police commissioner. He is a lawman then, not an ex-magician with UFO contacts or a cosmic artist who gets his material firsthand. But, deliberate or not, the police commissioner label is misleading. In the late 1940s, he became involved in a part-time administration of Burbank. He served variously as chairman of the City Parks and Recreation Commission and on the Planning and Fire Commissions in the late 40s and early 50s. In 1950, a city councilman moved up to become city treasurer, and Price was appointed to fill the unexpired term. None of this semi-pro politicking was first time. After 2 years on the council, Price was appointed the city council's representative to the Burbank Police Commission to replace another councilman who was leaving. In the spring of 1953, Price stood for election to a permanent 4-year seat on the council, but he was defeated and left the council in April at the end of his term. His total time in police work, as he terms it, lasted 10 months. Price also served as vice mayor of Burbank for about 1 month. As a parting gesture, the council appointed Price to the post in the middle of March 1953, shortly before he was to leave office. There certainly was no hint in those days that Price might someday end up at a research institute being studied for psychic abilities. Even old fishing buddies do not recall ever hearing him discuss religion or philosophy, much less his expressing any interest in the occult. They knew Price only as a Jack Mormon, one born into the Church of the Latter-day Saints but whom lapsed in his practice. One day in the summer of 1973, while Hal Puthoff was running a coordinate experiment with Ingo Swann, the phone rang and Price, at the other end, introduced himself, saying that he had heard of investigations the SRI team was pursuing. On the desk in front of him, Puthoff had the coordinates to a vacation cabin along Skyline Drive in the Blue Ridge Mountains, one of their classified test coordinates Swann remotely viewed recently. Price also claimed remote viewing abilities, so Puthoff simply called his bluff and read Price the coordinates, asking him to see what was there. A few days later, Price mailed in a 5-page description of the site, which Puthoff reports was really quite accurate, and Price was invited to join the SRI studies. Okay, so we'll actually be revisiting this mention about the first phone call from Pat to Hal Puthoff and the initial remote viewing in particular going forward, because this is one of the first examples in Pat's official narrative where things begin to get messy. So the next couple of pages of the book are some detailed accounts of the more mundane remote viewing sessions that Pat was conducting while he was there. So we're just going to skip ahead a little bit past that and get to the part where we start to hear from Pat himself in more detail. I see no reason why psychokinesis or remote viewing or any other method that would be considered paranormal is not available to anybody, declares Pat Price, with his usual unswayable confidence. I refuse to have any psychic areas that I cannot do. Considerable bluster, except that Price's contention is backed by a Puthoff testimonial. Even Rustag is forced to seek refuge in his logical, positivist upbringing when challenged by Price's outright assertions that he travels out of body to accomplish his feat. Whether he's out of his body remains to be seen, cautions Targ. Just how far out has Price's viewing been? Price pauses for a long time, staring straight at the questioner as if he had not even heard. I was looking at the term far out, he finally answers, then discounts the laughter, greeting the bad pun. Oh yes, that's a small marble. How about the solar system? That's a smaller marble. Really? Yes, this is a BB shot sticking out a pigeon's ass for about 10 million miles. That's just about the size of the thing we're on. How remote have you gone in your viewings? Get your wildest concept. I'd like a straight answer. Actually, I'm giving you a straight answer. Get the wildest concept of distance that you can get. Now just keep doubling it. That's how far I've gone out. That's not a wild answer. Have you been out to the edge of the universe and back? Price responds calmly as if it was just a summer jaunt to Europe. Oh yes. What's out there, I challenge? Zero. That's how you can tell the difference between the physical universe and when you're out of it. That's a very accurate description. If you see any motion or any activity, you're in the physical universe. When you get out beyond that, you're out of it. Then you can view it pretty much in perspective. That's pretty far out. It would violate the concepts of the average citizen. Violate hell. My concepts were getting R-worded, just as they had been when I talked with Geller and Swan. Listening to the super psychics of SRI can turn a person black and blue all over, not from psychokinesis, but just pinching yourself to keep sane. Yet here was another vouched for individual quietly declaring that he has been out to the edge of the universe and looked beyond, from being into nothingness. But how does Price know where to look? Prefacing his answer by saying that only similes will work to describe it, he explains, when one can truly view the planet, the whole planet, as a BB shot, anything on it doesn't seem hard to find. It's just that I seem to know it. Boom. SRI assigned me the target and there's no starting out. It's bam, and I'm right on it. Right now, just bam. For instance, if they're going to give me a grid coordinate or something else while they're actually telling me the words, I'm already looking at it. It doesn't seem to bother me, figuring out how, I just do it. Price continues, I found my out-of-body talents very useful aside from the research aspect. I don't have to worry about my wife, for instance. She conducts herself at all times exactly as if I were there physically. I don't have to worry about my mother. She's 96 years old, which is at a stage in life that many unexpected things can happen that the average person is worried about. Saying this, Price rolls his consciousness back inside his head and starts to search, mumbling. I just poke around. She's okay. She's not troubled. She's not worried. Watching the TV program. She's sitting there with the TV set. Sisters in the leather chair, brothers in the other room, lying down in the bedroom. Pat Price just ran a fast remote scan of his mother 300 miles away to the south, or so he claims. If anything bad befalls his family, says Price, it comes to his attention immediately, if he does not intercept it before it occurs. Bad things don't happen, he insists, exuding all the confidence of a self-proclaimed true believer. See, I'm a Scientologist, and that's the answer. Oh. And that's how John ends that section. So you might be gathering that John is rather skeptical of what's going on at SRI and remote viewing as a whole, but you can't really blame him for that. It's 1974. It probably came as a surprise to him that this type of psychic phenomena was being studied, let alone potentially possible. He's surrounded by Scientologists, and he also has Uri Geller telling him that the spectra flying saucers gifted him his psychic powers to bend spoons. It's a lot to take in. Now, we will be moving on from this book, I promise, but this is the most information that you can really get about Pat Price anywhere, so I do just want to continue a little bit more, because in a very rare account, we get to hear from Pat himself talking to John about Scientology, which throughout all of my research is the only time that I could find him doing so. Uri Geller has his Hoover. Ingo Swann thinks he was born with mind-probing powers. Pat Price? He says that his abilities, while latent in him since birth, were not awakened until he turned 50 years of age. I was asked to sit down and look at some other guy for a period of time and do nothing. After about 3 minutes, I found myself outside of my body, looking at him, looking at me. It was very interesting. Just like that. No incense, no Tibetan chanting, no $200 how-to course on astral projection, just your run-of-the-mill ex-gold miner unzipping his consciousness and stepping out of his body, gap-tooth country twang and all. Price previously considered the possibility of such an out-of-body experience, but slapping his chest admits that he felt, "If I got out of this body, I would drop to the floor like a piece of wet spaghetti." I firmly held to the opinion that it was impossible, that it was a bunch of bullshit and couldn't be done. I had heard others talk of it and thought that it was a figment of their imagination. Price's experience, a complete anathema to the Western rationalistic conceptions of reality, received its psychocatalytic stimulus not from drugs or mind-provoking set. I don't really know what a mind-provoking set is, but there you go, as some may have, but from a first lesson in the highly structured and controversial process known as Scientology. Oh yes, about those spiritual thetans who pass from generation to generation in different guises. Ingo Swann believes the thetan inhabiting his present body was once a psychic advisor to an 8th century European conqueror. Pat Price credits his reincarnated thetan for having once sparked the fiery oratory of Patrick Henry. Hoover doesn't seem so far away now, does it? For the non-Americans watching who may not know who Patrick Henry is, he is the man that blessed the US with the famous quote, "Give me liberty or give me death." Some also consider him to be a forgotten founding father of sorts, and Pat Price had his thetan attached to him. Allegedly. And the whole Hoover thing with Uri, just in case anyone isn't sure on that, he and Andrea Puharich claimed they could hear an alien voice in their mind called Spectra, and Hoover is where said entity originated from. Although I will say that if you have read Forbidden Sciences Volume 2 by Jacques Vallée, then what he noted down in his book about a conversation he had with John Whitmore and how Uri's friend Spectra came to be, it's actually pretty sick. Now, the very last thing that John ever writes about Pat is on the second to last page of his book. Pat Price died unexpectedly in Las Vegas on July 14th, 1975. The book didn't get published until a year after Pat's death, but you can tell from how he's wrapping up on this same page with a bit of a "so where are they now" type paragraph. Pat was still very much alive when this was completed, and I imagine it came as quite a shock to John to have to all of a sudden add that asterisk in before it went to print. Now, there is a couple of things from the search for Superman that stand out to me. One is how the Pat the Policeman narrative is highly inflated, something that still is to this day, and that he picked up on all the way back in 1974. It's a true enough statement. Pat, for 10 months of his life, was the Burbank Police Commissioner, but if he'd have spent 10 months of his life as a barista, I highly doubt we'd brand him quite so willingly in the same way. And I get why he'd be packaged up like this, because when you're trying to prove that psychic abilities are real, and you've got the likes of Uri Geller running around all over the world to tell every newspaper and TV station that will have him that he has mystical metal bending skills and hears spectra alien voices in his mind, and that the prestigious Stanford Research Institute is studying him to prove that. And then you have Ingo Swann, who is a flamboyant artist, which there is absolutely nothing wrong with, but we all know that in the 1970s these stereotypes were harder to break through. So if you can back all of that up with Patrick Harold Price, the former councilman policeman and police commissioner with a gift that solves crimes. Then I know what I'd be going with from a PR standpoint too. But as you'll come to learn throughout the episode, Pat's a far more complicated character than just that, and the police role was just a blip on his timeline in contrast to the many other facets of his life. The second thing I wanted to point out is when John says that Pat, unlike Yuri or Ingo, worked at SRI under deep cover and near anonymity, which raises a few questions for me, not least because it was Yuri with the links to Mossad, and Ingo who was tied to the UN and the US military, but Pat was the one that needed to be kept in the shadows. I find that to be very interesting, and we will explore that more when we get into some more information a little bit later on. The last thing that John notes that stuck out to me is that Pat was Mormon, although lapsed in his practice, and you can find mention of that here and there when researching Pat, but it's rare because of the fact he was also a high-level Scientologist, which tends to take the cake and overshadow everything else. And I'm just throwing this out there, not intending it to stick, just a little thought that arose for me during this investigation, but that I am in no way married to, or even think that it's a case necessarily. But if the rumours are to be believed about the three-letter agency's special little recruitment interest in the followers of Joseph Smith, then who knows? We don't really have a great deal of information about his life prior to joining the program at SRI to know of any connection to an agency or someone at an agency. Or do we? Okay, so that was the easy part. It's going to get very messy from here on out, and I'm going to have to do a lot of weaving to make any of this make any sort of sense, so buckle up. So now we're going to look at the accounts of how it was that Pat ended up at SRI in the first place. We've just heard from John about what he was told, but I do want to quickly recap that, just a couple of sentences from it, because that account alone does raise some questions. One day in the summer of 1973, while Hal Puthoff was running a coordinate experiment with Ingo Swann, the phone rang and Price, at the other end, introduced himself, saying that he had heard of investigations the SRI team was pursuing. Price also claimed remote viewing abilities, so Puthoff simply called his bluff and read Price the coordinates, asking him to see what was there. A few days later, Price mailed in a 5-page description of the site, which Puthoff reports was really quite accurate. Price was invited to join the SRI studies. John writes Pat introduced himself, which implies it's the first time that he's speaking to Hal Puthoff, the OT5 Scientologist who's working with Ingo, the other OT5 Scientologist to introduce himself as Pat Price, the OT3 Scientologist, who all live in the same area of California, and according to Scientology's Auditor magazine of special issue of March 1971, by that date, only 2,773 Scientology clears exist in the world, clear being the prerequisite to the OT levels, which estimates say only around 300 OT5s existed across the entire planet at that time. Now, if you know anything about Scientology, then you'll know that they like to host a big song and dance of sorts that all the members get involved with when one of the OT levels are achieved. In which case, what John was told requires me to believe that in this concentrated little area of California, that 3 OT level Scientologists, bearing in mind how long that would have taken them all to get to those levels in the first place, never knew about each other and never bumped into each other when those that are working towards those levels typically go into the centers for hours of auditing every single day. I don't think so. It's a cult. They're a tight bunch. They usually know who each other are in the area. Another question I have is, how did Pat hear about these experiments in the first place? How did he know that they were happening? How did he know where they were happening? And how did he know that it was Hal that he would need to call in order to get involved? Yuri didn't start his newspaper press tour until around 1974, but this was in 1973, and I can't find a trace in the news archives of anything being publicly mentioned about these experiments prior to Yuri. The options I'm then left with is either he already knew Hal or Ingo and they told him, which would be a severe breach of their clearances, or Hal or Ingo told their Scientology auditors, which again is a breach, who then told Pat about the program and then tasked him to get involved with it. So to get a bit of a clearer picture on this, now we will look at what's considered another staple in the remote viewing literature, and that's Jim Snabel's book, Remote Viewers, which he wrote in 1997. So let's see what Jim was told about Pat's arrival. Price was a greying, semi-retired, somewhat grizzled-looking fellow in his 50s who lived up in Lake Tahoe. He had a small building contractor business and also raised Christmas trees to sell in the Bay Area. He had met Putoff at a lecture in Los Angeles a few years ago, and Putoff and Swan had ran into him more recently in late 1972 as he was selling Christmas trees from a lot in Mountain View. Oh, would you look at that? They did know each other, and I love how he's told it's a lecture in LA because that is definitely code for a Scientology event. So who was it that let the cat out of the bag about the program? Hal, Ingo, their auditors, or someone else? Either way, someone told someone else something they shouldn't have because Pat had to know about this program somehow. Let's see what Russell Targ had to say in his book Limitless Mind in 2004. Since the beginning of 1973, we also worked with Pat Price, a retired police commissioner from Burbank, California. Pat had telephoned Hal and asked him if we'd be interested in working with him. He said that he had used his psychic ability all his life, in particular to catch criminals in his work as a police officer. Of course, we accepted his offer. Not really divulging too much information there, but lucky for us, he did write another book in 2012 called The Reality of ESP, a physicist's proof of psychic phenomena. Pat Price, who we mentioned in Chapter 2, was an unexpected gift to our program at SRI. One day in June of 1973, Pat called Hal Putoff to say that he had been following our research for some time now. We are not sure how. I feel you, Russell. I'm not sure how either. You'd think, however, you might have asked though. You know? It kind of feels like the first question that I would want answered. Thanks for calling, Pat. Love to take you up on the offer, but given what we're doing here is all very hush-hush, how the hell did you find out about it? Just seems logical to me. Instinctive even, but never mind. Now, by we, I think it's safe to assume that he's referring to himself and Hal here. Russell was not a Scientologist, although his lab assistant was. I tend to believe Russell when he says that he doesn't know how Pat found out about the program. I think he's admitting his suspicions, but there is a good chance he really didn't pry into it because he was surrounded by all of these Scientologists. I'm well aware that daily confessionals of sorts were an aspect of all of their lives. But if he is telling the truth and correct in the assumption that Hal truly didn't have a hand in this either and was blind to how apparently Pat had been following their work, then I do have a third option for you to consider. An account of how all of this transpired, buried deep enough that you're likely to never stumble across it by chance, and it might go a long way in explaining this whole debacle. However, I can't go launching bombs just yet, or it's going to get way too confusing way too quickly, so hang tight. So now we're going to take a look at Paul Smith's book, who was one of the military's remote viewers further down the line in one of the offshoot programs that followed. And this one's called Reading the Enemy's Mind, and it came out in 2005, and in it, Paul writes, "On the day Putoff was set to task Swan with the CIA coordinate, he got a call out of the blue from a fellow named Pat Price. The two men had met at a social event some time before, but Price had heard about the remote viewing work on his own and was calling up to volunteer his services. Christmas tree of it all has also disappeared in Paul's book, as it does in Russell's, and once again we have this mystery and lack of explanation of how Pat knew about the program and Hal's involvement in it. If we go to the next and most recent publication that also talks about Pat's arrival at SRI, then that would be Annie Jacobson's book, Phenomena, written in 2017, and let's take a look at what Hal told her at the time. Then a strange thing happened. One of those occurrences that in retrospect could be interpreted as a little too opportune to be written off as mere coincidence. One evening, a few days before Christmas, Swan and Hal Putoff took a drive over to the suburb of Mountain View, 10 miles south of SRI. It was time to buy a Christmas tree for the SRI office. There, in a parking lot, they got into conversation with a man in his late 50s who was selling evergreen trees. "I'm Pat Price," the man said, extending his hand. He was short, mid-50s, with a grizzled face. He told Putoff that he recognized him from a convention in Los Angeles the year before. He also said that he read the local papers, so he knew about the experiments going on at SRI. Putoff and Swan smiled politely and did not say much more. "If you ever need any help," Price said, "I can handle anything." It was a strange thing to say, Puthoff recalls. It would get even stranger. That Price met Puthoff and Swan at a Christmas tree lot sounds like something out of a folk tale, but Pat Price would soon become a towering figure in the CIA's psychic research program. Okay, so we have the Christmas tree story again. Not an introductory phone call out of the blue to the office, but we do get a few more twists here. Though we've just heard Russell Targ say on behalf of him and Hal that they don't have a clue as to how Pat found out about these experiments being done at SRI, Hal tells Annie that Pat recognised him from a convention, which is again code for a Scientology event, which she actually does confirm later on in the footnotes of her book. Apparently somebody had brought that up and she addressed it with him and he confessed. But he tells her that Pat read about this in the papers. As I've already said, I can't find anything that's been archived in the newspapers prior to 1974 that divulges the detail of SRI's research. Anyway, you may have noticed that Hal told Jim Snable that Pat and him met each other at an LA conference the previous year, and that he and Ingo then bump into him again later down the line at the Christmas tree place. Then Pat phones about the program, never explaining how he knew about it. But he eventually tells Annie that Pat introduces himself at the Christmas tree place and that Pat had only seen Hal's face at this event, implying that they didn't meet at said event and the need for an office Christmas tree is in fact what facilitated the first meeting. And Annie doesn't mention a phone call, just that he would later become a towering figure in the program. She also notes from Hal that when Pat told him and Ingo that he knew about their work and offered his skills to be tested, that Hal said it seemed a strange thing to say. Then she goes on to say, yeah, the whole thing sounded like folklore, but you didn't think to push back then. You didn't ask him why he thought it was strange. You have access to Hal, you can ask the questions and pry when something smells off, but nope. You just say, that one's a bit sus, and then on with the book you go. Thanks, Annie. And I'm really not trying to be rude here, but what was the point? What are you offering here that all the authors before you haven't already done? Which is repeat the same old convoluted, slightly altered version of events that will forever beg more questions, that every time someone gets themselves into the position to do so, they don't. If you ask and they shut it down, fine. But just tell us that's what happened, because that alone tells me more than simply repeating a 50-year fallacy. And if you're wondering why this even matters and how and why Pat joining the program is even important in the grand scheme of things here, then it's because it's representative of how no one can ever get the story straight on this man from the very first moment they claim to have met him. And if we can't even get a clear answer on something as basic as that, then how are we to trust all of the fantastical claims that come from the same people about Pat thereafter? And moreover, how can we take them at their word about the events surrounding his death? I know they're only small alterations and redactions, but why is that happening over something as seemingly mundane as to how Pat joined a research program? I don't feel like that should be hard to keep straight or require cover stories, unless you're hiding something. I don't think that whenever I poke around when it comes to what people say about Pat, that it should fall apart or be so overly contradictory in one account to the next. Because if you watched my part 3 and you've seen me lay out the flaws in the fanfiction that is repeated about how Pat came to view the 4 alien bases and how they came to land on Hal Puthoff's desk, then you'll be noticing a pattern by now. It's not just Pat's death that's strange, it's his life and how obscure and often misleading people are when they talk about him. So what can we gather so far? He's a Mormon, he's a Scientologist, he's a psychic, he raised and sold Christmas trees if you want to believe that. He's a councilman, he was a police commissioner for a period of time, he was in the construction business, he mined gold in Alaska, he was an armed guard, and for some reason, even though Yuri had or has ties to Mossad, and Ingo already held a top secret clearance from his time working for the military and also had a background with the UN, it was Pat Price that was the one that had to work under deep cover in near anonymity during his time at SRI. Why is that? Why does it feel like there's something more here, and that's why people trip over themselves when asked about it? Who the hell was Pat Price? Well, to figure that out, we are going to need to unravel some more of that right now, and to do so, we need to go deeper into the buried parts of the internet where accidents are scrubbed, overexposure is banished to, and where inconvenient information gets cast into the doomed fourth and beyond pages of the search engines where no one dares go. So the first thread that I want to pull on is one that John Willow mentioned in The Search for Superman, and that is that Pat worked as an armed guard protecting the mail. I hadn't heard the term protecting the mails before, and in case you haven't either, then apparently it refers to someone that provides armed security in the transportation of valuable cargo or sensitive documents. Early on in my research, I found a profile on Pat that listed him as a security guard, and I couldn't for the life of me corroborate that anywhere else until I found The Search for Superman. Now, I desperately wanted confirmation for that claim, not so much because of the role Pat held, but more so due to the company that this profile claimed he provided those services for. And that would be everyone's favourite aerospace and defence contractor. I know, I hate it when people do this too, but seeing as I've never done it before, forgive me. If you were excited by the prospect of that revelation, then I have plenty more where that came from in this video and hopefully into episodes yonder until the day comes when I can sleuth no more. And so if you are enjoying yourself, I would very much appreciate it if you could hit subscribe, because it would be nice for my own dignity to reach at least 2,000 subscribers. And if you don't click that button, there is a good chance you'll never hear from me again or even be able to find me, because YouTube is yet to index my channel, so the search bar will not lead you back here. I'll be over here rambling regardless, but if you can like, subscribe or comment, it would really help me in making YouTube recognize that I even exist, and so that people can find me, because I can't even find me. It's a bit of a problem. Everyone's favourite aerospace and defence contractor, Lockheed. Pat was at Skunk Works. Allegedly. I say allegedly because short of someone coming forward with a payslip or an employment contract, this is something we only have people's word for. That said, Pat lived in Burbank, he worked in Burbank, he raised his kids in Burbank, and during Pat's lifetime, Skunk Works was located in Burbank, California. And I imagine Skunk Works was the kind of place you might need armed security for the protection and security of valuable cargo. I also found this fabulous flowchart someone made, although I don't actually know how I found it anymore because I had it saved as a PDF in my Pat research folder, and when I went to find the source of it again, I couldn't. So if this interests you, because there's a hell of a lot of information on there, then take a screenshot of it now if I haven't managed to locate it, and put a link in the description. But as you can see, shooting off the Lockheed branch is Pat Prey. No source, but it is there, and it seems like whoever made this did do their homework, but sadly, it's no verifiable evidence. Okay, it's time to introduce a new face in this series, a name that you've most likely never heard of before because the man is practically non-existent on record, and that's Harold Chipman. And just to clarify, just in case any of my fellow Brits just choked for a second there, I'm saying Chipman, not Shipman, one of the UK's most prolific serial killers of all time. Harold Chipman, aka Chip, aka Steve Orwell, San Francisco CIA station chief in the mid-1970s and 80s. You know, during the time where that same alphabet agency was running rampant mind control experiments in the Bay Area under various branches of MKUltra. It is truly no small miracle I have a picture of this man's face to show you here. After months of attempting to get a look at this guy, I was settled on presenting the only known image of him in existence to you as his gravestone. And then I found yet another obscure PDF with a reference link to his wife's Vietnam veterans page, and lo and behold, we have our man. But there is another man in this picture, and I couldn't leave him out given how relevant he's about to become as we dig deeper into Chip. I'm sure my American viewers know exactly who that is. Mr. Theodore Shackley, aka Ted Shackley, aka the Blonde Ghost. And I know you might be wondering where the hell is this going, but we will get there, I promise. As I've already mentioned, information on Chip is scarce at best, and that might actually be underselling how mythical this man seems to be. That tends to happen when you're looking into someone that operated most of their lives in the underbelly of military and intelligence darkness. He's the type of CIA guy that you're never supposed to know about even once they've passed. I can track two nicknames to him, one being Chip, the other we'll find out about in a minute, and then one alias, and that comes from the lone existing article in the world that mentions his name, which is a Yahoo piece on a guy that was recruited by Chip, or as he knew him to be, Steve Orwell. Let's take a quick look at what he had to say.
I said, okay, I'm going to have a guy named Steve Orwell give you a call. He called a few days later. He said, let's meet at the Redwood Room at the Clift Hotel. You won't have any trouble spotting me because I'll be wearing a blue suit and a bright yellow tie. I believe at our first meeting in this very room, Mr. Orwell told me what the CIA was interested in was responding to the sudden Soviet interest in the Reagan campaign. So what they wanted was somebody that had a legitimate and plausible access to the Reagan campaign in California. San Francisco was never a particularly friendly town to be a Reagan Republican, but I was. They told me quite a bit about Pavlov himself. They had some profile information. They said they identify their profiles by people that have domestic problems, may have problems at work, may have alcohol problems, and then something else that they looked for called the messianic complex, which they described as a belief that somehow you could change the world, that you as an individual, no matter how insignificant you were, you maybe had a chance to make a difference. And so they had identified Pavlov as having several of these characteristics.
So there's no major revelations here, but it does give you an idea of the type of thing that Chip was involved in. I'll leave a link in the description once again for the article because it goes into way more detail about this case and it does make for an interesting read, full stop. I was able to find him in the 1974 US State Department Biographic Register, which lists a very light version of his life and career history. Apart from that, there are 2 books with Harold Chipman's name mentioned, albeit briefly. One being Blonde Ghost, written in 1994 by David Korn, which revealed Chip's CIA employment for the first time and the extent to which he was involved with the assassination of Tai Kak Chuen, sorry if I'm saying that wrong, in June 1969, who was suspected of being a double agent as a South Vietnamese intelligence asset working with the CIA and US Army Special Forces. Now, I'm not going to read the 4.5 pages that touch on Chip. What we find out in this book is that Harold Chipman served under Ted Shackley in Berlin in the mid-1950s and JM Wave Miami in 1962 to 65. Subsequently, Shackley was the CIA's Western Hemisphere Division Chief in 72 to 76 and Deputy Director of Operations May 76 to December 77, and Chip was considered his protege. The second book, with an extremely random one-time mention of Chip, appears in The Secret History of the CIA by Joseph J. Trento, written in 2005. And this is where we learn his second nickname and some other things. The most popular places for sexual encounters were the safe houses used and maintained by the CIA. These residences were supposed to be kept vacant for agent interrogation. No sensitive cases could be brought back to the same safe house a second time. In Berlin, those common sense security practices went by the boards. Not only were safe houses used for the interrogations again and again, they were also used by BOB officers for sex. That meant Berlin base officers could be identified and also blackmailed by the KGB. We had 30 safe houses, many of them villas, Sherwood recalled. One night I had come back because there was a guy I hadn't been able to break. I hadn't been able to get him to talk to me. Sherwood heard what was obviously a sexual encounter upstairs. Using the alias John Black, he announced himself, with his bewildered agent in tow, only to see CIA officer Harold Chipman, dressed in a Goering-style leather coat, descend the staircase in the company of a platinum blonde. Chipman's nickname at the Berlin base was the Omaha Bull. Yeah, so moving on from that, the last scrap of information to be found about Chip is via his second wife's veteran page, which confirms that they were both in the military in Vietnam at the US Embassy in Saigon in 1967. All that to say, I had to dig up everything I possibly could find about Harold Chipman for myself and so that I could show you, because where or who it was that I originally heard about him and what they claimed he was involved with was never going to be enough to not have a fair few people dipping out once I said the name of the original source, which is Jack Sarfati. And I know he's a motor mouth, he says a lot of stuff and makes a lot of wild claims, but I'm not a fan of looking like an idiot. I do my bit to verify where I can and tell you where I can't, and if I'd looked into this and decided there was no merit to any of it, I wouldn't be including it. But the majority of what he said about Chip checked out, and what I haven't been able to verify, I was never expecting to in the first place, because it's not the kind of stuff that is accessible to the likes of peasants like me. So let's get into what Jack had to say in the early 2000s, and this is where you're going to hear about that third option I mentioned earlier for how it was that Pat might have found himself at SRI in 1973. In the mid-80s, I met Harold Chipman. He was the station chief of the Central Intelligence Agency in Munich, Germany, and he ran MKUltra in San Francisco. Chipman started funding my work in 1985. He said that he had secretly funded part of the SRI work in remote viewing. Harold Chipman believed that RV worked and told me that he had used it successfully in his business. Indeed, he introduced me to a glamorous private detective, V, as one of his best performers in remote viewing operations. V and I became lovers. She confirmed that she had participated in experiments with Chipman. I was then simply a young, inexperienced, naive, useful idiot in a very, very sophisticated and successful covert psychological warfare operation run by the late Brendan O'Regan of the Institute of Noetic Sciences and the late Harold Chipman, who was the CIA station chief responsible for all mind control research in the Bay Area in the 70s. Chipman, aka Orwell, funded me openly for a while in 1985 when he was allegedly no longer in the CIA, and covertly before that. I lived in the apartment on Telegraph Hill, home to the CIA's Operation Midnight Climax, 1955 to 65. Michael Murphy lived there before me, and I got the place from him. He was an important part of MKUltra going back to the 50s and had a hand in the SRI remote viewing project of Putoff and Targ, with astronaut Edgar Mitchell and Brendan O'Regan involved too. Pat Price was a close associate of Chip's, and Price was a star of the RV project along with Uri Geller and Ingo Swann. Putoff was not aware of Chipman's role in what he was doing at the time. I don't know if Ira, which I think he means Ira, is it Einhorn? You'll know what I mean, I think. I don't know if Ira knew Pat Price, but the late Harold Chipman of CIA said in 1985 he was one of Pat Price's closest friends and had something to do with Price coming to SRI. Price and Chip may have also been involved in the same industrial security firm in the Bay Area. In July 1974, Pat Price does an operational remote viewing of a facility near Semipalatinsk of the USSR. This was really controlled by Harold Chipman at a layer Hal Putoff was not privy to. Chip met Russell Targ at Henry Dackins in 1985. Don't know if Russ recalls, but there were witnesses. Breon Levitt, me, Bob Jones, Kim Burafato. Hal Putoff still refuses to acknowledge Chip's role in all of this. Chip told me Hal was out of the loop on that for security reasons. Pat Price came to SRI because of CIA Station Chief Harold Chipman. Chip told it to me directly and to Bob Jones and to the others at Henry Dackins at a talk given by Russell Targ in the mid-80s. Now, I did actually locate those original emails between Jack, Hal, and I think Kit Green, but stupidly I never saved them and I have never been able to track them down again. But Jack does go on to quote from them, so I have seen these and they do exist. So this first email is from Hal Putoff to Jack Sarfati. I see that you have repeated the claim that Harold Chipman was involved in the funding loop for the SRI program. This is incorrect. I, of course, knew all the details of the funding stream since I was directly involved. Chipman had no role to play, even covertly. Dr. Kit Green, one of our oversight monitors from CIA, has notified some people in detail about this incorrect claim. In a follow-up email, Putoff stated that, I must admit that I don't remember meeting Chip at SRI, but also have to admit that doesn't mean much because we met so many people on a one-time basis. I still remain certain, though, that he was not involved in funding us, just as Kit gave details on in an earlier email to you. And because I knew the details of our funding streams, much of which is still classified. Chip was associated with the San Francisco office, if I recall, along with a female person, and we were strictly forbidden to fraternize with the San Fran office because one of the main reasons that we were classified was that we had anything to do with the CIA and they didn't want us blowing our cover. Okay, and then the article that ends, that includes all of this, says, in a meeting with Sarfati, Russell Targ, Putoff's colleague, stated he did remember a visit of Chipman to the SRI facilities. Alright, so hopefully you now realise why it was that I wanted to provide all of that context to Harold Chipman, so that you could understand that once this claim was made that he placed Pat into SRI and was one of his closest friends, just the gravity of the overall situation. And where to even begin with all of this? What I will say is that in the emails with Jack explaining more about Chipman's past, it sounds a lot like wild speculation, and it's hard work to verify, but if you do dig deep enough and put the effort in, then 90% of it, as I've tried to show, does check out. One of the main connections that I can't confirm is to MKUltra, and that really shouldn't surprise anyone. However, I don't think it's remotely out the realm of possibilities that in the 1970s, San Francisco was a hotbed of culture wars fueled by the CIA's Operation Chaos, and you have Jolly West and his Haight-Ashbury clinic there. It's the home of Operation Climax and all sorts of various dodgy different kinds of subsects of MKUltra being run through that area, that the CIA station chief at the time might have something to do with that. And I did find partial corroboration for this, but it's only a fragment and I can't actually see all of it because it's on that academia website that I don't have access to as I'm not a scholar. So I don't have the full context, but I do have a portion of the text. And what I managed to grab was from that Kim Burafato. I don't know if I'm saying her name correctly either, but Jack did mention her earlier, and she tells, all I can see is an author, I interacted with Chipman a few times. Jack Sarfati was with me. I do remember discussing the LSD safe house with him, as in the late 1950s, I was a 9-year-old kid who lived just down the street from the apartment where they conducted the Operation Midnight Climax. He's also being truthful about the funding that he received from Harold Chipman and the Sarfati Institute that Chip wanted him to create for all manner of out there things because he coughed up the documents to prove it. Although there is this particular document, one that I found referenced all around these circles that appeared to cause a little bit of a ruckus, and at the time it was released was called the Chipman File. Whatever it was, whatever it contained, it's gone now. I'm pretty good at unearthing things from the scrublands of internet erasure, but I cannot for the life of me get hold of that thing. The Wayback Machine links have also been wiped clean. He also claimed to have gone to SRI himself in 1973 and met with Hal, Russell and Brendan O'Regan, and he's not lying about that either. There's a tape of them meeting to prove it, and boy do I have an interesting snippet from that for you in the next episode. So that just leaves us with his claims about Pat. He says that Pat and Chip were very close friends and that Pat ended up in the remote viewing study at SRI because of Chip's covert funding of the program, and as we've already been through, there certainly seems to be some weirdness surrounding how Pat found out about the program in the first place and then ultimately ended up being a subject in it. And if you notice in the emails that Hal sent to Jack, it's the one thing he doesn't deny. He does not deny Pat's connection to Chip, he just denies Chip's funding. Is that proof? Of course not. But it is worth noting. Now it's from Jack that we again hear this claim about Pat's work in security, but in this context he says that Price and Chipman both have connections through security to an industrial firm in the Bay Area. Based on what others have attested to about Pat's security past and the few unaccounted for references to him being at Lockheed, and now Jack saying that both Chip and Pat were involved in a security business for the same industrial firm, when we know that Lockheed didn't just have a presence in Burbank but also in the Bay Area in San Francisco too, and that the CIA will often oversee the security of the private contracts that they hold with these companies, and that Chip was CIA. Again, it doesn't sound too implausible to me, at least, that all of this weaves together in some way. And I've got to say, it would be a pretty weird thing for Jack to just make up, because say what you want about Jack Sarfati, but I don't see the rationale behind making up a lie about the friendship of two dead men, one of whom nobody really knew existed in the first place, and the other you're in contact with people who knew the guy personally and should be able to easily debunk your claims if untrue. It doesn't elevate his career or standing within the scientific world, and Russell Togg does appear to be friends with Jack, or at least appears to be willing to do talks with him still to this day, after all of these covert funding allegations and secret friendship accusations. So honestly, I don't know, but something about it does feel tangible to me. Don't worry, this isn't me jumping in to ask you to subscribe again. I will be taking this form for the rest of the video. Hopefully it wasn't too noticeable and I've done some editing wizardry, because I was having a lot of issues in that first part. I'd been sat here for hours, I'd had a lot of setup and audio issues all of that day, and then where I just left off is where my camera eventually died, just to top everything off, and I just took that as a sign that I should wrap it up and then approach this fresh face the following day. So that's what's happening, and I'm just going to pick up straight from where we left off and jump into the final few things that I have to cover about Pat Price. And if you are still here and you've made it this far, thank you very much. Something else that I want to note and will lead into my next point is that very first remote viewing that Pat did of the Sugar Grove facility, where he was supposed to be viewing the cabin in the woods, but instead his consciousness got pulled towards that secret NSA facility, as did Ingo Swann's. And when that was found out, all hell broke loose, and it was believed that there'd been a big breach of security leaking into SRI, until ultimately everybody was cleared, and off the back of these unexpected, amazing results, the CIA decided that this remote viewing research was a worthy project and started to fund the program, and that secured its future for another 2 years. I'll be honest with you, something about that always felt a little bit off to me from the get-go, and I can't speak to Ingo Swann on any of this because he's not been the focus of any of my research efforts, but the vibe I'd been getting was that interest was waning and funding was drying up for the SRI RV program, and the remote viewing that Ingo had been doing for Hal and Russell was proving itself to them to warrant further study, but they were going to need a big hitter of sorts, something that sent a ripple out that couldn't be ignored. Now, as I'm sure many of you already know, Hal Puthoff did work for the NSA, and so I always felt like, well, there's one person at least that probably had some sort of prior knowledge about this top secret NSA base, and he's a Scientologist, and then you have 2 Scientologists tasked by him, and I think you catch my drift with where my line of thought was going with all of that. So that was what I'd suspected had potentially taken place, but then I started to notice the inconsistency in how it's reported that Pat even delivered on this target in the first place. From what I can gather, Ingo did his sessions straight away at SRI, so there's a good chance that what he did was a genuine viewing, if we're to rule out any sort of Scientology shenanigans. But then Pat calls up out of the blue, and the CIA have just slipped this target to Hal, and all of a sudden he thinks to himself, well, why not give it a go? Can't do any harm to have 2 sets of data here. If we go back to the very beginning, to the first account that we ever hear of this happening, fresh off it not long having been done, then that would be what John was told for the search for Superman. On the desk in front of him, Puthoff had the coordinates to the vacation cabin along Skyline Drive in the Blue Ridge Mountains, one of the classified test coordinates Swann remotely viewed. Price also claimed remote viewing abilities, so Puthoff simply called his bluff and read Price the coordinates, asking him to see what was there. A few days later, Price mailed in a 5-page description of the site, which Puthoff reports was really quite accurate. Price was invited to join the SRI studies. That raised alarm bells for me as soon as I read it. Pat has a set of coordinates for days. Enough time to make some phone calls and do some digging of his own. Enough time to ask his Scientology auditors if Ingo Swann had reported working the same target and what he got, which was my initial suspicion, as I've already said. Or it's enough time to meet Harold Chipman and get the lowdown. Now, if we look at what Russell Targ said in his book, we do get some useful insight as to what this was, how it came to be, and how unprecedented to this day Pat's results were. These were what the CIA called demonstration of ability trials. Using coordinates provided to us, our 2 psychics were able to look into and describe correctly an NSA secret cryptographic site in Virginia. This was a free test for the CIA to determine whether they would have any further conversations with us about anything. Ingo Swann made a detailed drawing of a distant site, as we described earlier, and Pat was able to name correctly the site and read code words from the national security files, as confirmed by both NSA and the CIA. Reading anything is an exceptional feat in our remote viewing experiments. In my experience, Price's ability remains unprecedented. So now I just want to have a look at what Hal told Elizabeth Lloyd Mayer for her book Extraordinary Knowing in 2007. So the CIA told us they'd give us geographic coordinates, latitude and longitude of a site they wanted our people to remote view. The idea was that this would be a rigorous long distance test under external control. Pat Price happened to call right after I'd gotten those first coordinates from our CIA contact. There they were, sitting on my desk just as I got on the phone with Pat. Why not, I thought. Why not test this guy with these. Pat agreed and immediately sent us a 5-page report. Immediately, hey? Not sure I'd call days immediate. Feels a little bit like, as so often seems to be the case when it comes to Pat, narratives are adjusted and altered to inflate his legend as time goes on, or maybe even cover some tracks. I'm not saying that Pat wasn't psychic, make no mistake, I think he was, but it doesn't mean that there wasn't a little bit of sleight of hand going on to make sure that the right people were in the right places, performing the right things at the right time to keep the money flowing on occasion either. And hopefully it's not just me, but now that we have the potential of Pat with this alleged friendship with Chipman on the table, and Chipman with this alleged RV interest and covert funding of this very program, is this Sugar Grove situation and Pat's arrival at SRI not starting to feel a little inorganic, a little bit too conveniently engineered? So I thought maybe the best place to look for answers about this would be in the official report done that detailed all of the efforts of this session of Pat and Ingo done by another CIA spook, Ken Kress, also known as Pat's handler, that was eventually submitted to the funding powers that be. The target was a vacation property in the eastern United States. The experiment began with the passing of nothing more than the geographic coordinates of the vacation property to the SRI physicists, who, in turn, passed them to 2 subjects, one of whom was Pat Price. No maps were permitted and the subjects were asked to give an immediate response of what they remotely viewed at these coordinates. Again, considering this was the official CIA report, I think that this immediate terminology is very misleading because let's face it, under any other circumstances, Pat being given a set of exact coordinates at home, totally uncontrolled, with the results turning up by post 4 days later, wouldn't pass the smell test today, and if an immediate response was what they wanted, shouldn't have then either. But now that we're on it, let's continue with this report because it leads me to my next issue. This discovery led to a request to have Price provide information concerning the interior workings of this particular site. All the data produced by the 2 subjects were reviewed in CIA and the agency concerned. The evaluation was, as usual, mixed. Pat Price, who had no military or intelligence background, provided a list of project titles associated with current and past activities, including one of extreme sensitivity. Now, call me pernickety, but one would assume that in a report such as this, accuracy matters. You're kind of led to believe that this type of document is the go-to for facts, you know, the kind of thing that you'd use as source material, because if it's not the case, then you might find yourself looking like a tool saying things that aren't actually true. Pat Price with no military or intelligence background. Yep, me. I'm that tool. Silly me thinking that something as mundane as someone's civilian career history in an intelligence report would be something I could rely on as factual information. Because I did refer to this report before I made that statement because it seemed like the right thing to do. But no, you can't take anything at face value these days because Pat, in fact, did have a military background. Granted, he's not like Joe McGonigal with an extensive army record, but if you're going to say that someone has no military background, then you're talking about someone like me. Someone that's never had a brush with camo apart from a few questionable fashion decisions as a teenager. But most definitely not someone who was drafted at 21 and is then referenced in another source as a cadet for the US Army Air Corps a few years later and is remembered as a World War II B-17 pilot in the Pacific in a newspaper obituary. And it's not like when this report was written in the 1970s, they just happened to not know, because John also wrote about this in his book, The Search for Superman, in 1973. So people knew. Now, if you ask me, that, by my definition, is a military background. Because it's not one, is it? Or am I crazy? And who knows how long he was actually in for, because the next time he pops up is in the 1950s when he starts his council run. Why does it feel like his military career is being covered up? Why is it being quietly erased from the conversation? And why do even the accounts of that said military stint also not make sense when you stack them against each other too? Because I'm no military or World War II buff, but from what I can gather from when B-17s were being used in the Pacific during World War II, and when Pat was in his cadet training in the Air Force Base in Arizona at the time, it doesn't make sense. Either he wasn't a B-17 pilot, or someone got the aircraft wrong, or someone got the dates wrong, or the location wrong, because apparently he's still training to be a pilot 2 years after B-17s are practically out of use. I feel like there's something more here, like something about this time frame might hold a missing puzzle piece that will allow us to see the bigger picture. And if he was a pilot, does that connect back to this whole Lockheed situation? Because a lot of ex-Air Force people end up working with defense and aerospace contractors. So many questions, never any answers. Okay, so there's some things you need to know about Pat's life before we get into his death on the next episode and before we touch the Nixon of it all in this one. Pat was married 3 times. His first wife is who he had his daughter with, Patricia H. Price, and Mr. Patrick H. Price's second wife is who he had his son with, Mr. Patrick H. Price. I'm sensing a theme. His third wife, we're not going to go there just yet because that will become more relevant in the next episode. Now, I want to play you this clip from last year's appearance from Hal Puthoff on Joe Rogan, so let's just take a little look at that.
One day, Pat Price, during the remote viewing program, came in the office and he said, I got bored last night, so I started looking around and I decided to look at the Oval Office. And as I kind of did my way around the Oval Office, I realized there's something in the Oval Office that will harm him and he will not get through his second term. And I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, but I have to report that to the CIA contract manager, which I did. And so they sent a team over looking for, hidden microwaves, hidden toxic substances, and when they didn't come up with anything. Of course, as we now know from history, it was the tape recorder that did him in. And he couldn't make it through his second term because he...
So this was during the Nixon administration?
Yeah, Nixon administration.
Wow.
And so interestingly enough, when he reported that to us, I said, oh my God, that means Spyro Agnew will be president because he was the vice president. And he says, no, he goes first. Now, it turned out he did go first because of some money laundering.
Just keep what Hal said there in mind as we go into this next part. So I was reading this massive article written by a ex-Scientologist, and it was a piece that basically drew many connections about Watergate in sort of a parallel timeline and the Scientology angle of it all being wrapped up with the government and state figures too. It had a mass of information about Hal and Ingo and all of their whereabouts across, I think it was about 10 years. And honestly, the whole thing is a rabbit hole in and of itself. And if you do want to tackle reading that, then I'll leave a link in the description. It's a very interesting read through. But what I was obviously looking for in there was to see if Pat's name came up at all to try and establish what either Hal, Ingo, or Pat might have been mixed up in when it came to the co-infiltration, double agent malarkey going on between the government and Scientology, in case it led to any leads to do with his death. And for some reason, I could not get that Nixon Oval Office remote viewing out of my mind. It was like a living red flag in my brain and I couldn't figure out why. Ultimately, Pat didn't end up being mentioned in the article, but the spidey senses were still tingling, and quite honestly, I was side-eyeing Scientology and angling to find out if they had someone on the inside at the White House that knew about the recording device all along, and that had got back to Pat somehow, because as I've just noted, when I was looking at that timeline, there definitely seems to be an inference that the followers of L. Ron Hubbard had some part to play in Watergate in some way, shape or form. I type into the search bar Oval Office Patrick H. Price, and I don't really know why I did, because my line of thinking wasn't that Pat had ever been there or anywhere near Nixon in general. I was on the lookout for a rogue Scientologist lurking around the president that could be a potential candidate for feeding information to their auditors, but not Pat himself. And then I find this. A Patrick H. Price in the Oval Office with President Richard Nixon on the 10th of November 1971. Can you imagine me finding this? Can you imagine what came out of my mouth? But I was trying not to get too ahead of myself. Obviously, the secret recording device was already implanted in the Oval Office at this point, so there is a tape attached to this page, but the audio is awful, and I don't know what Pat's voice actually sounds like anyway. Apart from that, I had no context, just a name, one of which I'm sure the Pat that we're talking about was not the only bearer of. But I did have a date and a location, so I got Nixon's diary log for the 10th of November 1971, and there he was again. Patrick H. Price listed as a staff assistant. And honestly, I got a bit deflated at this point because staff assistant for a guy in his 50s just didn't feel very fitting. It's a young man's job, someone who's on their way up, who can run around doing errands and sprightly things. But I wanted to be sure, so I started to look at the other people listed in the office within that day. It says that this Pat Boone person was present and is also an entertainer, so I look into him. Yeah, it turns out he's quite famous, isn't he? I'm sure many of you knew that already, but you're gonna have to forgive me because my mum was only born then, let alone me. The diary also says that there was a photographer with them in the Oval Office, so there had to be photos, and I was hoping to find them and that Pat's face would just be there, but no such luck. I then found a 30-minute silent film on YouTube with scenes from various things Nixon did from October to November in 1971, and in the description it said there was a scene from him at the Crown Plaza on November the 10th, which is corroborated by his diary, and that he then met Pat Boone and his family on the same day. I watched it over and over again. I know the quality isn't great, but I know the guy I'm looking for, and I've collected a fair few pictures of Pat at this point, and he ain't there. Up until very recently, I wasn't even going to mention this because I tried to dig more into who this Patrick H. Price was in the Nixon administration, and there's no trace of him, at least from what I can find over here in the UK anyway. And don't bother asking AI for help because it will tell you that this Pat Price in the Nixon office is the Pat Price we're discussing here now, because it's just a lying conflator of information. All that to say, I found that in mid-December last year, and it bugged me relentlessly because I don't like dropping a lead when my intuition tells me otherwise, but I felt like there was nothing I could do. Then last week, just for the hell of it, even though I told myself enough was enough on the Pat research 3 weeks prior to that, I decided to take advantage of the 1 week free trial of newspapers.com. I thought it couldn't do any harm, and as a last ditch effort of information about Pat before I went to record this episode. And a couple of things happened at that point. Some of them I can't get into because it's for next episode, but without giving away too much just yet, there's another man in Pat's life I have yet to introduce you to. Someone that I'd been struggling to confirm if that person in Pat's life was this person. My strongest connection at the time was that they were both Salt Lake City Mormons and the names matched, which wasn't a terribly strong thread. But this guy, he also worked in the Nixon administration in 1971, and that perked my ears up. So when I went rifling through the good old printed press and finally found a link that was undeniable between the two of them, I went harder on the Nixon of it all again, but this time from a different angle, because Patrick H. Price was also Pat's son's name, and buried on the God only knows what page I'd reached combing through the archives of newspaper.com was this. Former Californian Patrick H. Price has been named as staff assistant to the President of the United States. His duties will include the administration of all White House public tours and arrangements for visits to the White House by VIPs and foreign dignitaries. Prior to his present appointment, Mr. Price was on the staff of the Council of International Economic Policy and also served as the administration assistant to... can't tell you that one yet. Prior to his present appointment, Mr. Price was on the Staff Council of the International Economic Policy. He is a returned missionary, having served in Hong Kong and Taiwan from 1965 to 67. Mr. Price is a native of Burbank, California. He received a bachelor's degree from San Fernando Valley State College, and he attended graduate business school at George Washington University. A native of Burbank, California, exactly where Pat raised his son and lived most of his life. The right age based on a census record I have for Pat in the 1950s, a graduate from the same university as Harold Chipman, which is probably nothing, but you never know, and most importantly, he'd served as an admin assistant for the very man I'd finally confirmed that Pat was friends with, and I mean like close friends. You'll see why I'm pretty certain of that in the next episode. Now, is this solid proof that this Patrick H. Price is Pat Price's son? No, I don't have any photos of the guy. I can't find him. Well, I haven't given him the full Sherlock Holmes treatment, but I did do a decent amount of digging to find out if he's still alive. And given that I didn't locate him as having passed, maybe he is. I know Pat's daughter died mid last year, so it's possible he's no longer with us. But what I do have is photos of Pat, and it was the extra ones that I found of him in the papers that, as crap as they may be, they do give us some other profiles of his face face, and crucially, him smiling with his teeth. Not his thing, apparently. He was a lips together guy. Now, I just want to show you them, absorb them, take in his features, pause if you need to, because then we're going to look at that Nixon video again. If you're watching this on Premiere right now and during the live chat, tell me if anyone sticks out to you, and if you don't do it quickly, then before you know it, I'm going to point out who the candidate is that I think you should take a closer look at, and then the glory shan't be yours. I know it's super grainy, but it's the 1970s, it's the best I've got. So what I'm going to do now is cut it down to just the moments where we see him, slow it down, and I'm also going to put on the side of the screen some pictures of Pat for you as well, just so you've got that comparison. Okay, so the guy I've got in mind is going to come into the left of the frame just for a brief second. He's in a light grey suit. Here he is. And then here he is again. We get a decent look at his face here. This is the moment for me when I seen him turn to the side where everything changed. Am I crazy? Is this not Pat's son? Does he not have that same cheeky grin that Pat has? The same nose? And obviously I didn't even know the guy, but I feel like I've read so much about him at this point that I almost feel like just watching him in that room that he has that same larger than life magnetic presence that Pat is written about to have had so much as well. Now, one more thing that I just wanted to chuck in, and I do have to stress, I couldn't find anything to substantiate this claim whatsoever. It comes from Pat's WikiTree biography, and there is actually a few mistakes in that I've noticed already, but I've not seen this said anywhere else, and I do have to wonder where it came from. The same day, he flew from Washington DC to Salt Lake City, where he met with his son, who interestingly enough had a position on President Gerald Ford's White House staff. Now, if that's true, if his son did go from Nixon's staff to Ford's staff during Watergate, and we have this remote viewing session from Pat, then I don't even know what to think at this point. So to my American viewers, please put me out of my misery here. Can any of you find anything, or can you tell me anywhere that I might be able to gain access to myself from over here in the UK for some further information about this Patrick H. Price that worked for your government in at least 1971 for the Nixon administration and potentially beyond into the Ford presidency too. There are some things we'll probably never know about Pat's life, but this feels like something we should be able to confirm. Let's just break this down, all things considered. He's Mormon, and I have him confirmed with another Mormon on high standing in the Nixon administration, an administration that his son potentially worked for, as well as potentially the Ford one too. He was a military Air Force cadet in World War II, maybe even an active pilot. He mined gold in Alaska. He was an OT3 Scientologist. He potentially worked for Lockheed Skunk Works, overseeing valuable cargo, and we all know what sort of valuable cargo they likely have in those hangars of theirs. Something that, strangely enough, Pat was also deeply interested in, claimed to know the locations of even. He was a city councilman, he had a stint as the police commissioner. We have him as a potential close friend of Harold Chipman, also with speculative ties to Lockheed, also the guy alleged to be behind some of the CIA's covert funding of the SRI RV program, the program that Pat one day ends up in and that no one seems to know, or at least admit, how we found out about it to end up there in the first place, where his very first remote viewing results pertain to a ultra secret facility, the coordinates having been handed to Hal Puthoff from the CIA as a funding exploration target on the very same day Pat conveniently calls the office and is sporadically given those coordinates to test his skills with, before days later he's posting over secret code names locked away in filing cabinet, a feat that no one had, or allegedly has, ever since achieved, at a previously unknown to the public government facility, which is in turn so impressive, secures the CIA funding and the researcher's future for another 2 years. And while he's there, he's working under deep cover and near anonymity. What the hell is going on here? Okay, we are nearly at the end. The final thing I want to touch on is that famous semi-Palantinced viewing of the Russian nuclear facility, now that you have all of the information that I've just brought forth. And if you remember from earlier, this is the one that Harold Chipman told Jack Sarfatti that he orchestrated. Where did that target come from? The CIA. Who at the CIA has been on covert missions to Russia? Harold Chipman, who did that Yahoo piece, also state was working under the cover of the alias Steve Orwell, grooming KGB and Russian defectors to become CIA assets in the 1970s. Harold Chipman. It's safe to say that if anyone had a treasure trove of Russian secrets, it was Chipman. So we should probably take a look at that semi-politics viewing for ourselves to see if there's any whiff of anything off about it, because people love to bandy around that viewing and the drawings of the gantry crane. So let's get the reported facts straight on it. On the 9th of July 1974, Pat Price is given the exact coordinates of the semi-politics test facility and is told that the target is a scientific military research and test area. That's important. Times were different, protocols were still in development, but he had the exact coordinates and was told what to expect to find there. This is a far cry from the type of double-blind remote viewing protocols that professionals are adhering to today. The semi-politics remote viewing session began on the 9th of July 1974, and in the review of Pat's first day, they're not too impressed. And just pause here if you want to read what they had to say. That night, Pat is told to go and work the target at home, control measures be damned. So off he goes with the coordinates and a description of the type of facility that it is. The next day is when Pat turns in that famous sketch of the gantry crane that he'd produced at home. And on the 10th of July, when he begins the second day sessions, he says, "I'm seeing a lot of things today that I didn't see yesterday." There's a lot of back and forth on the second day, and I've put a link in the description to the entire report, which I highly suggest you read through for yourself so you can make your own mind up instead of taking anyone else's or my word for it when it comes to this viewing, because rarely are you provided full context. To cut a long story short, the experiments wrap up on the 15th of July 1974, and the review of the other days are mixed to say the least. Now, in the sketches provided within the document, Pat never dates them himself, but they are stamped as received, and if you watch part 3, you'll know how I like myself some handwritten Pat Price dates and received stamps. What people are never told is that the next most famous sketch of the semi-politics viewing is not included in the official review document of the sessions, which is strange. It's this particular sketch of the Sphere segment, the one that we're always told that Pat was vindicated on in death once further intelligence emerged. It's stamped as received on the 18th of July 1974, 3 days after the review claims that the sessions wrapped up, which is fine. The SRI team may have decided to continue working the target for their own reasons. But what interests me about this page is that for the first time, Pat has a handwritten date on the page, to which he tells us the sketch was done in June, 1 month before this target was given to him. A mistake? Maybe. I certainly don't discount that possibility, but what are the chances that his alleged close friend Harold Chipman, the Russian intelligence collector with a personal interest in remote viewing, had already asked Pat to look at this site before it went through the official channels? Frankly, I can't discount that possibility either, because if we're being honest, considering that this is said to be one of Pat's greatest viewing achievements of all time, there is not a world in which today that this would pass the smell test. And it brings me no joy to say that. I don't want to feel like I can't trust anything that's said or claimed when it comes to Pat, but I won't ignore the red flags waving in my face either. I'm not just going to overlook these things because I don't want them to be true, because I like Pat, and because I think that from everything I've learned about him over the last few months, he sounds like a cool guy, the type of person with charisma that ripples out to every corner of a room. And I don't care what he was up to as long as it's nothing too immoral or dark, but I want to know that he was up to it so that I can factor that in for consideration when a lot of these grandiose claims are being made about him. None of this changes how I feel about remote viewing, and none of it has wavered the faith I have in the viewers that I follow to this day. And as I've already stated, but it's worth saying again, I'm not suggesting that all of this information means that Pat was not psychic, that everything he did was carefully fed intelligence masquerading as remote viewing. But do I think that some of his work could have had a healthy dose of that? Yes, I do consider that a strong possibility, and I think he was psychically gifted too. You don't have to agree with me. I'm not asking you to, because I have no dog in the fight as to whether or not you believe in Pat Price's psychic prowess. I don't need to blackpill you or make you a believer. I just want the public to have information and to be allowed to make informed decisions for themselves instead of being covertly navigated in a certain direction through unchallenged anecdotes, carefully concealed truths, and people's willingness to repeat anything as long as it's fantastical enough to generate clicks. And when it comes to Pat Price, it doesn't need to be either everything he did was authentic or all of it is a lie. More than two things can be true at once, and if you aren't willing to allow for that nuance, or if you're too attached to something being one way or the other, you're gonna miss the signs when they're staring you in the face. So I think at this point it's fair to consider and to finally ask the real questions. Was Pat Price way more connected than maybe even the likes of Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ even knew at the time? And through those connections, did he make his way to SRI? Because yes, Harold Shipman was clearly, demonstrably interested in parapsychology and fringe research, and he had a psychic friend or colleague in Pat Price that he could put on the inside. Someone that could be genuinely tested and perform, but that also ensured that all the info about what was going on at SRI made it over to the CIA station in San Francisco too. The one that Hal said they were told not to fraternize with in case the affiliation they already had with the CIA at any level was blown, meaning Harold Shipman could forever remain unsuspectingly in the shadows, instigating further CIA funding by one-off wonder viewings performed by Pat Price with the aid of deeply classified intel known only to the likes of Chip due to the things he was involved with too. Was Pat Price a military pilot, and did this lead him into work with Lockheed, and is this where he met Harold Shipman to begin with? Did his son work within two Whitehouse administrations during the Watergate scandal, something that Pat psychically claimed foreknowledge of before the world and the president did? Is there something much darker, more nefarious even, to his knowing about that, and it's these types of concealed connections that led to his death? Because there's a thread back to Chipman with all of that too, and what he was doing with American and Russian assets involved in the Reagan campaign, which is also mentioned in that Yahoo article. There are too many things here that circle back to each other for my liking, and honestly, we'll probably never know the answers to any of that. But I'm not the only one who has these questions too, because I found this FOIA request filed by Harold Shipman's son, Garrett Shipman, in 2022. Alright, if you've made it to the end, thank you so much for watching. I know this was an incredibly long one, and hopefully you're now feeling like separating the mystery of Pat's life from the mystery of his death was the best decision to make. It just would have been too much, and that's a whole different disaster to come, and there's no shortage of contradiction and cover-ups involved in that debacle too, so keep an eye out for that. Thank you again for watching all the way through, and I'll see you in the next one.